Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode. And today I have with me Christian Perez-Font. Christian has one of the most unique law practices that I've come across. We spoke at a conference 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, because it was pre-pandemic in Miami. And we've kept in touch since then. And I've had him come on several different podcasts to talk about his approach to legal issues. And it's very analytical, data-driven. And we're going to explore his legal approach to some ESG topics today. So, Christian, first of all, for that incredibly long-winded introduction, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Tom. It's always a pleasure to come and hear and learn and share ideas. It's great to be here.
So, Christian, could you tell us a little bit about your professional background and then what led you to founding your law firm, which is called Thinkeen Legal?
Sure. So I'm a lawyer by trade. I spent most of my career as a transactional and M&A lawyer, and then drifted to compliance, which in the view of my former M&A colleagues is sort of like going into the dark side. I actually view it as the other way around. I'm actually going to the light side of the force. I've always had a more business-like approach towards compliance. I view compliance as a business support function rather than, the Department of Business Prevention that many people think of it. So that sort of business approach is what sort of led me to create my own firm and offer something different. The way that I view my practice as a lawyer is that not that I provide legal advice, but that I provide business advice with legal content. And I think that is the mantra that makes us different. And in that context, we like to use data and data analytics to help our clients set up better compliance programs and better business processes in general. Because again, what we're talking about is really business, making business happen, making business more agile rather than making it more complicated and more cumbersome.
So, Christian, you look at legal projects, as you said, from a data and analytical approach. I was wondering if you could give us some general thoughts about your approach about looking at projects such as M&A or compliance or others, but how you would think about those issues from the ESG perspective.
Sure. Well, when you look at data and at legal projects, I think you need to think about data from two perspectives. First, you need to think of data as fuel, because it's what keeps your compliance cycle going on, your business cycle going on, but also as a measure of progress. Because when you have fuel and you've expensed part of your fuel, how many miles you have gotten. So you have a goal. It's also a measure of progress towards a certain goal. Now, what those goals are is for the company to decide, and that's where ESG, is important, because you have to have goals for each component of your ESG program, whether it be, governance goals to social responsibility to environmental goals. You have to set those, and then you have to have a way to measure your progress towards those goals. That means that, you might have, for some parts of your ESG program, huge amounts of data that you need to analyze in detail. In other cases, the data might be a little bit more limited. So, for instance, when we talk about data in the governance side of things, you're probably going to have less amounts of data to track than if you're thinking about social responsibility or other matters. So it's helping companies understand what ESG is, the role of data in general, and then how to extract, how to set goals, and how to measure each one of your goals in the ESG spectrum.
Christian, as you know, I advocate the compliance function should either lead or be a significant part of a corporate ESG effort. I, of course, come to compliance from anti-corruption compliance and then have expanded out to a broader remit of compliance. But you have a background in healthcare compliance. And I found that really interesting. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about what you see as the intersection of data, healthcare compliance, and ESG.
Well, that's a topic that's very close to my heart because it's the bread and butter of what we do here. There's a huge intersection of ESG and compliance, and that you will see mostly on the social responsibility side of things, and also on the governance. And I think depends a little bit, it varies a little bit depending on whether you're talking about pharma versus whether you're talking about medical device or you're talking about a service provider. But it has a huge link to those. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So when you are looking at an acquisition as an investor, one of the things that you want to look at these days that you didn't look at before was social responsibility programs. Why social responsibility programs? Not just from, this is the company that I identify with and that I want to invest, but from a corruption standpoint. Why? Because many times in the healthcare sector, we've seen some companies use social responsibility initiatives for improper purposes. So there's a possibility of a company making an excess amount of donations to a particular foundation in exchange for referrals. So when you look at the amount that a company invests in social responsibility, when you look at who are the recipients of those social responsibility programs, it can give you a lot of good information from a compliance perspective as to what it is that it's going on. And it also gives you the possibility of asking more questions. So if you go in and you look at data indicating that, a pharma company is giving X amount of dollars to this foundation, then you can ask the proper questions during due diligence. You can ask, okay, can we see the contract, your donation contract? Let me see, is there any quid pro quo involved? That kind of things. So it's very, very relevant from an anti-kickback statute perspective or a False Claims Act to have that data from a healthcare compliance perspective. In the case of medical device companies, when you look at the governance side of things, asset management. How are your assets being managed? For instance, how many products or medical devices you have on the field as demonstration? Are they being used as an incentive for patients? And there are precedents to that effect. There was one of the biggest AKS and FCA cases ever was the case of Olympus Corporation. And one of the things that was there was that the company would give out as loaners for evaluation products and then not collect them for a long period of time. And during that time, some doctors could continue to use them to generate business. So it was, in a way, viewed as a free loan. So again, a good asset management, which is part of governance system, can give you a lot of information from a compliance perspective as to what is going on. And those are just two examples that come to mind.
So the E part of ESG, I think this one gives most compliance professionals the most difficulty simply because it tends to be more of a technical subject matter, environmental. And they feel like they need really an environmental law or more importantly, an environmental science background to be able to be a part of this initiative. I see things a little bit differently, but I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how does data play a role in environmental compliance tied together with ESG?
It's very interesting, and I've found myself having the same conversations around environmental things within the context of ESG. And I think that one of the things that I keep hearing is that people who tend to be cognizant and think about the E in ESG are usually companies that manufacture goods, that have plants, that have, and to call it a way, an extended environmental footprint or activities that might be subject to regulation under environmental laws, which is, I think, in my view, a very limited view of environment. I think environment has to do with a bunch of things. It has to do with, a company that's not manufacturing, but, that's just warehousing. What kind of warehouse? What kind of what is your energy spend? What are you doing to protect the environment? It has to do with, how we respond to pandemics. How many employees do we want to have in the same place? How many, what's the trash that's being generated by your cafeteria on every single day? What kind of utensils do we want to have in our cafeteria, and what's the carbon footprint? So I think that when we think about environmental, data, we need to expand our view and think of it more broadly, even though if our company is not heavily invested in manufacturing operations that generate pollution or anything like that. The other thing that I think it's important is that people tend to think that an ESG program, you have to basically disclose everything you're tracking, and that's not the case. The data analytics is about using your data and being able to present data that is relevant. But sometimes you have data you're going to be tracking that you don't need to put out there. You can track the data. Okay, you can use it for process improvement. You can use it for continuous improvement, but you don't need to track and put that. An ESG program is not going to become, or should not become, the Instagram of corporations where you have to show absolutely everything. It is what is relevant to investors in terms of transparency. Sure, you want to talk about governance. Yes, you want to talk about anti-corruption. You want to talk about social responsibility. You want to talk, and you want to have some metrics around it. But that doesn't mean that you need to have huge amounts of data to present in each one of those categories.
So the G in ESG governance, that's an area that I think most compliance practitioners are frankly doing a lot of, whether it's reporting to a board of directors, creating policies and procedures, working with and through internal controls, and a wide variety of other topics, strategies and tactics that could properly be seen to be in the governance prong. Yet, this is an area that I think most compliance practitioners struggle the most with around data. So I was wondering if you could also talk about how do you see the role of data in the corporate compliance function tied to the governance prong of ESG, Christian?
Sure. Well, again, that's another one where we have, I think, big touch points. We have, as I mentioned before, governance around asset tracking, which is very, very important from a compliance standpoint, more so in the healthcare space. But you're also talking about other things that you should be tracking. You should be tracking things as political contributions. What is the company doing about its political contribution? How is it tracking political contributions? Those are important things that should be put out within an ESG report within the governance side of things. Talking a little bit about diversity. I think that one of the things that might sound foreign to many compliance practitioners is that some of these topics, when we talk about, executive compensation, we talk about, independent directors, we talk about diversity, many people tend to think of those things as more HR related, but in reality is not something that's just matters to the HR department. It matters to the entire company, and therefore it can be a part, and it should be a part of a good ESG program. And I think that compliance people have a very good understanding of data, or what to look for and where to look for, and understanding it. And I think that makes them uniquely qualified if they want to try to understand that. Again, it's not the same to say that you're going to make a data analysis of 200,000 Medicare transactions versus looking what's the evolution of your diversity program at some point in the company. The other thing I think it's important for compliance people to understand is that sometimes when you're tracking data, when you're talking about data in generally, not necessarily you have to expect that you're going to get data right away. That day one that you start tracking, you're going to get trending information, or you're going to have your aha moment. No, data is about tracking. It's about trending. It's about understanding how a specific metric moves around, time. It's, as I mentioned, it's fuel, and at the same time, it's a measure of progress. But if you don't start tracking it, you're not going to get anywhere. So the first thing you need to do is to track it. And then once you've tracked it for a significant amount of time, then you can go back and say, okay, I understand what's going on. Then you can understand if there's a spike, if there's a change, why that change happened, whether it was the right change, whether you need to make adjustments to your program. And I think that's, it's an important piece of the puzzle. I personally think that I have more, hesitation in many ways, because it's probably a little bit more foreign on the environmental side, on tracking, on understanding environmental metrics, than I have on governance. And especially because many compliance people have legal backgrounds, and it should be a little bit natural for them to understand it.
Kristen, one of the kind of things regulators have looked at more in the European Union and United Kingdom than the United States, but it is the issue of greenwashing. And that is where basically a company or investment firm claims they have a more robust ESG program than perhaps they do. So I wanted to use that as a lead in to the importance of ESG audits and the importance of data you collect. And really, how would you advise a client to have data, not make it the Instagram transparency, but have it available to auditors if requested for an appropriate audit, so that you could publicly report your results and meet your reporting requirements under the SEC or whatever regulatory scheme you might be under?
Well, the first thing is to understand data itself. I think that's where people really struggle the most. I've always said it. I think, many years ago, my dad gave me a book as a present when I sort of started getting more interested in these topics, called, How to Lie with Statistics. And many people have used actually data analytics or pseudo data analytics to show, this is, how good we are. So one of the biases in data analytics is, of course, when you use it to validate something that a conclusion that you want to show, rather than using it as a tool of discovery. I think that's the first thing. So to the extent that you, as a company, understand that what you want to use data is to find out information and not to validate information, you're on the right track. But yes, there is a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of bad use of data analytics. And I think the role of the auditor, the role of the person in charge of ESG or tracking, is to really understand what you're tracking, is to challenge any assumption that may be flawed in setting up an ESG tracking program, and make sure that the data that you have is real. One of the things that I always think about is for companies that tend to outsource manufacturing, where they have plants in, let's say a plant in the US, and they say, our plants are very green, we're very conscious of the environment, but then, 70% of your product comes from, manufacturers in another country that don't have the same level of environmental responsibility that you have. Or you haven't taken the time to go and audit and make sure that what these guys are telling you and are reporting you is real. All right. So that's the importance of audit. Audit needs to ensure independence. It needs to ensure that the data collection is real, that the data itself is real, and that the premises around data collection are the right premises. Because if you start with the wrong premises, if you use data as a validation and not as a discovery tool, then you're in problems.
So, Christian, one of the most interesting developments, I think, over the past year, perhaps 18 months, has been really the move away from a regulatory-driven ESG to a market-driven ESG. And you have advised clients extensively, I believe, on mergers and acquisitions, looking at compliance with your data analytics approach. So I was wondering if we could maybe turn to ESG and business ventures. And how should an M&A or an acquisition company, whether that be a U.S. public company, whether it be a private equity company or other group, use data to evaluate ESG and potential acquisitions?
Well, there's a number of different ways to do that. Of course, the first thing you want to do when you're doing an acquisition is you really want to know who you're buying from, or who you're selling to. Knowing your partner, and this is again not just for acquisitions, even for joint ventures, it's very important to have a good due diligence and understand who you're dealing with, and also understand their ESG program. So it's not just knowing, okay, this is someone who's not on the SDN list at OFAC, and therefore he's fine. No. I want to know what you're doing. I want to know, I want to look at your social responsibility program. I want to know what's your environmental footprint. I want to know what is your compliance program look like, to see if you're the right partner. If you are the person that, if I go to the market and I say, we've merged with this company, the market is going to react positively because they're going to go and look at this company and they're going to do the same due diligence that I did, and they're going to say, okay, fine, this is a good fit. So I think that it's definitely something important. Now, how deep you go into each one of the ESG areas, it's going to depend on the level of sophistication of the company that you're doing business with, or you're acquiring, or you're selling to. It's going to depend on the industry, because again, as I mentioned when we were talking about healthcare compliance, there are very specific concerns depending on the industry. If you're looking at a company that has significant operations outside of the United States, you're probably going to want to focus more on what kind of internal controls they have in terms of FCPA, that could implicate the FCPA, political contributions, that kind of things. So I think it depends. It's very tailored depending on the proposed transaction, on the sector that this company operates in, and whether it has international operations, domestic operations. But at the end of the day, you do want to incorporate in your due diligence all of the three ESG parts. You want to look at governance, you really want to look about social responsibility, and you also want to look at the environmental side of it.
Kristen, would you make the same analysis or a different analysis for a potential joint venture partner, or would it depend on the business sector?
I think it's, well, I think there's a basic level of diligence that you need to have with every single partner. Whether you go deeper might vary, not necessarily on the sector. The sector is probably, will give you a clue as to where you need to focus on certain things, but also as to how this company operates. Where is this company getting their revenues from? Where is this company sourcing products from? I think that one of the things that has changed significantly lately is that people have become more aware of OFAC sanctions. So trade sanctions and trade compliance have become a huge part of the analysis in ESG and compliance. And that is something that should be incorporated into every single, analysis. Now, when you talk about sectors, when you talk about, oil and gas, when you talk about mining, those have considerations of their own that you need to be aware of.
So the final area that I want to explore here is, you've talked about transparency, but not having to be an Instagram account in terms of showing all data. Mm-hmm. But how do you help a client or think through using data to tell their ESG story, whether it be through data visualization or part of an overall narrative? If you want to put out something to the investing public, how do you help a client think through that issue?
Well, I think the first thing, I love data visualization. I think it makes a huge difference. I think that when we were in the conference in Miami, I think you met Tanya Gromadsky, who is now she's now at Chewy, and she is a big data visualization person in compliance, and she's very good. And she has several stories about how you can change the reaction and the perspective of boards when you present data in the right way, and how you generate that conversation. So I think the first thing you do in terms of changing that mindset is first preaching to your own board and to your own executives to the extent that you can present information to them and they can see it as a valuable asset. That immediately translates in information that you can share from a business perspective outside of the organization. The battle, though, sometimes with some of these things is, of course, when you have to have these conversations with the general counsel, because there is a tendency in legal people in trying to protect and not disseminate information or control information dissemination, because there's the perception that this information might come back to haunt you. If you say, we've had X number of investigations related to corruption in the company this year, that might not be a metric that you necessarily want to share, but you do want to share, we've been investigated by the Department of Justice and they found no findings in their investigation of X transactions. So it's with some specific metrics, it can be tricky to convince some people in the organization that is data that you should share. But in other cases, it's good sharing that information. I think that the other thing that's changed is that nobody expects that a company is going to be, especially in a compliance program, that everything is going to be 100% okay. And I think that when you change your policies because you found something that didn't work quite right and you change it, it's a sign of progress. It's not a sign of weakness. It's rather a sign of a program that's evolving, that's adapting, that's getting better. And sometimes it's good to tell that story. So I think that, for instance, one metric that it's okay to present from a compliance standpoint is this is how often I've revised my policies, and I've made adjustments, and I've made adjustments to track this and to adjust for this. You don't need to go into disclosing a specific findings of a specific case or investigation, but saying I have processes that I constantly improve upon is a good story to tell. When you go and you say, we've improved our, environmental footprint, and we have a smaller carbon footprint right now, it's a good story to tell. If you show, this is how, diversity has evolved during, these many years, it's a good metric to have. I think I might have mentioned this before. One of my first ventures into data analytics and compliance was a couple of years ago when I was working in-house, and we were thinking about messaging. And I suddenly started thinking about, how to deliver the right messaging in compliance. And I thought that the way to do that was to try to understand what we were made of in terms of generation. So I asked HR to provide me with, roughly, numbers for each group, how many Gen X's, how many XY, how many millennials and everything. And that I was really, really impressed when I got that data back, because it sort of made me realize that we were not really crafting messages appropriately to the audience. So it turns out that the company that I was at that time was a company that was, way more millennials than Gen X's or baby boomers. So I told my boss, we can't do this. We need to find another way to communicate. Let's create an app. Let's create a compliance app, something that people can have in their phones. And just tracking how the company has evolved generationally speaking is important and tells a good story. And that is something that the board ultimately received and understood very well. And it helped not only in compliance, but it helped in other processes.
Unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if our listeners wanted more information on either yourself or Thinkeen Legal and the services you guys provide. Where could they go?
Well, they can, if they want to find more about me and they want to read, things that I've written. I am quite active on LinkedIn. They can find my profile under Christian Perez-Font. I regularly post articles on compliance-related matters. You can follow that. You can look at our website, which is https thinkeenlegal.com, or you can write us an email at info@thinkeenlegal.com. We also have an Instagram page. We don't use it that often, but once in a while we post things, and we also post updates on Twitter whenever we have something interesting to share with the people.
Chris, I wanted to thank you again. I always learn a lot from these discussions, and I hopefully I can call upon you down the road when we get some additional information, hopefully around some international standards that we can talk about as well. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. It's always a pleasure to come, learn from you, exchange ideas. So whatever you need, we're here.